The wind blew hard against the wooden boards of the old town, sending dust swirling in swirls of pale yellow. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the worn street. The town was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. At the far end of the dusty path, a lone figure stood, her arms bound, her head held low. The rope around her neck was a cruel reminder of the accusations that had torn through the town like a bad cough. Rita Hayes, barely more than a girl at 17, had been marked with the worst of curses in the eyes of Red Canyon. Witchcraft. Whispers followed her like a shadow, how she could make things happen with just a glance, how animals would follow her too easily, how the storms always seemed to follow her steps. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter in this God-forsaken place. Lies, rumors, and half-truths were what ruled. "Do you have any last words, Miss Hayes?" the sheriff asked, his voice hollow as he stood beside the platform, the gallows towering like a dark symbol of the town's deepest fear. Rita's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Her mind raced, her heart thudded painfully against her chest, but her tongue was heavy, choked by the weight of everything. There was no trial, no defense, no mercy. The crowd had gathered, a sea of faces that couldn't even look her in the eye. Most were just here for the show. They had seen enough hangings to know the routine. But then there was him, the one man who still looked at her like she was human. Lucas Harlow stood at the back of the crowd, hands buried deep in his pockets, the brim of his worn hat pulled low over his face. His eyes, though, betrayed the pain he was feeling. He was a broken man, just like her. A soldier who had seen too much. A man who had buried his wife in the ground beside their homestead. He had been through the fires of war, the flames of loss, and yet this was a kind of injustice he couldn't stand for. He'd heard the whispers about her, too. Hell, they said she was the devil's child. But he knew better. He knew how people could twist the truth when fear gnawed at their bones. And Rita, she was no devil. But there were no heroes here, just the wind and the weight of silence. The sheriff gave a sharp nod, signaling the end. As the rope tightened, Rita gasped for breath, her legs buckling beneath her, her hands pulling against the binds. But there was no escape. And then something broke in the air. A sudden voice rang out from the crowd, small but carrying a weight. "Don't you dare touch her again." It was a child's voice, one so fragile it almost didn't belong in this place of death. The crowd shifted, and for a moment there was an unsettled murmur. The voice came from a little boy, his wide eyes locked onto the hanging girl. His mother, one of the town's richest women, tried to shush him, but he wouldn't be silenced. The crowd grew uneasy, unsure of what to do with the spark that had been lit. The sheriff stiffened, but the moment passed. And in that moment, something began to change. Lucas stepped forward, his boots grinding against the dirt as he made his way to the front. His heart ached with every step, and though he had no claim to Rita, the injustice was clear in his bones. As the rope started to tighten further, a sound, faint but growing, cut through the air like the crack of a whip. A horse's hooves, pounding against the earth, came closer. It was him, Lucas. He reached the platform, his hand outstretched, grabbing the edge of the rope before it could pull the final toll. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice filled with raw urgency. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but Lucas was already there, standing tall in front of Rita, cutting the rope with one quick movement. She collapsed, gasping for breath, the blood rushing to her face. The crowd stood frozen, unsure of how to react. But the spark had been lit. Rita, trembling, looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been waiting for the end, expecting it, but now she was here, alive in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the weight of the noose. Lucas helped her to her feet, his hands gentle, despite the gruff exterior. But as their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. A weight neither of them had been prepared for. "Get on the horse, and don't look back," Lucas said quietly. The sheriff watched them, stone-faced. He couldn't stop them. The law may have ruled, but sometimes survival came at a different cost. The crowd began to shift, murmuring in confusion. Rita hesitated, but then nodded. She had no choice but to follow him. As they mounted the horse and rode off into the setting sun, the town stood still, the sound of their hooves, the only thing breaking the silence. Rita's heart raced in her chest, not from fear this time, but from something far deeper, something she couldn't yet name. Will Lucas's defiance be enough to save Rita's soul? The road stretched out in front of them, long, dusty, and unforgiving. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in a haze of violet and orange. Lucas Harlow rode ahead, his posture stiff, his face set in a mask of determination. Rita sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist as the wind whipped through her tangled hair. It was an odd feeling, being held by someone, yet still so alone. She should have been grateful, should have felt relief. But instead, the weight of everything, her wrongful condemnation, the eyes of the town, pressed down on her like 1,000 stones. She had been saved, but for what? Was it just a temporary reprieve? The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the dirt road, but the silence between them was thick, suffocating. She wanted to say something, anything, but words seemed useless now. What was left to say? She wasn't even sure who she was anymore. "Where are we going?" Rita asked softly, breaking the silence. Lucas didn't turn around. He just kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Somewhere far from here." Her fingers tightened around his waist, but she didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way his words seemed to promise a future she didn't believe in. He didn't owe her anything. He had no reason to help her, especially after what had happened. But then, what had happened was clear. The town had marked her as a sinner, a woman who was too free, too wild, too different. They had painted her with the brush of fear and sent her to the gallows, even though they knew nothing about her. It wasn't just about witchcraft. It was about control. It was always about control. The horse carried them farther, the night air growing colder, and Rita shivered. The chills had nothing to do with the temperature, though. It was the weight of what she had just escaped, death, and what she had left behind, her life. "Do you believe it?" she asked suddenly, her voice raw. "That I'm a witch?" The question hung in the air between them like a bullet waiting to find its mark. Lucas hesitated, his grip on the reins tightening for a moment. "No." His voice was calm, steady, like a promise. The answer should have comforted her, but it didn't. The world had seen her as something monstrous, and now she was something less than human in their eyes. The shame had been branded onto her so deeply she could feel it like a scar across her soul. The road ahead was a blur, the moonlight casting long shadows over the ground. The wind howled through the barren land, carrying the scent of dust and dry earth. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, a sound that reminded her of the cruelty in the world. But there was something else now, something fragile and small. It was a glimmer of hope, or at least the illusion of it. She could feel the rough warmth of Lucas against her, the steady rhythm of his breath. "You're not alone anymore," Lucas said, his voice low but firm. "I'll make sure of that." She didn't know how to respond. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone after what the world had done to her? "I'm not looking for protection," Rita replied, the bitterness creeping into her voice. "I don't need anyone to save me." Lucas didn't answer at first, but she could feel his muscles tense beneath her hands. He was thinking, weighing something in the depths of his mind. After a long pause, he spoke again, quieter this time. "I'm not offering to save you, Rita," he said. "I'm offering to stand beside you. There's a difference." The word struck her like a thunderclap in the dead of night. She hadn't expected such honesty, such rawness. There were no promises here, no grand gestures, just a quiet understanding between two broken souls. She leaned her head against his back, the wind biting at her skin. But for the first time in days, she felt something other than dread. She wasn't alone. The moon climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the world around them in cold, silver light. The road ahead seemed endless, the horizon far beyond their reach. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They rode on, side by side, against the dark night. Will Lucas's quiet promise of support be enough to heal Rita? The fire crackled softly as the night pressed in, the dark sky swallowing the last remnants of daylight. The flickering orange glow of the flames illuminated the rugged faces of the rocks around their camp. Lucas sat on a fallen log, his eyes fixed on the fire, while Rita leaned against the wagon wheel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The night was quieter than anything she had ever known. There were no sounds of distant animals, no chatter of townsfolk, just the wind and the crackling wood. And in the quiet, Rita's mind began to stir, restless and unwilling to settle. She had tried to push the memories away, the town, the gallows, the way they had looked at her like she was already dead. But they came rushing back in waves, overwhelming her, flooding her chest with that old, familiar fear. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice trembling as she spoke into the silence. "I never did." Lucas didn't turn around. His face was hidden in the shadows, but she could feel his presence. He had been quiet all night, lost in his own thoughts, and she knew that there was something deeper he wasn't saying. Rita had never seen him this way before, calm but distant, as if the pain of his past had hollowed him out. The weight of his own ghosts hung around him like a shroud. "Does it hurt?" Rita asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She wasn't sure why she asked. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to know. But the words slipped out anyway, like a crack in the dam. Lucas turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the light of the fire. "What does?" "Everything, the past, the things we can't change." For a long while, there was no answer. Rita waited, unsure of what she was hoping for. Some reassurance, maybe. Some sign that she wasn't alone in the way she felt. But all she got was the silence, and then finally, his voice, rough and low. "It doesn't get better," Lucas said quietly. "You just learn to live with it." Rita's heart clenched in her chest. "How? How do you live with it?" Lucas exhaled slowly. as though the words themselves were heavy in his lungs. "You bury it," he said, his tone hollow. "You bury it deep, so deep that even you forget it's there. But you carry it. It never really leaves you." His words were a cold wind against her skin, but somehow they felt true, like he had lived through it, like he had learned the same bitter lesson she had. The past didn't let go. It gnawed at your bones, kept you awake at night, kept you running until your feet were sore, and the ground beneath you felt like it would swallow you whole. For a moment, Rita thought about the life she had lost, the one that had been torn from her without warning. The world had branded her, accused her of being something she was not. And for what? For the fear of her difference? For the spark in her that they couldn't control? "I won't run anymore," she said suddenly, surprising herself. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the words had a power of their own. Not from them, not from anyone. Lucas looked at her then, really looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You don't have to run, Rita," he said, the softness of his words a rare thing. "But sometimes the road ahead is all we have." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood. The road ahead was a long one, stretching endlessly into the night. It was filled with uncertainty, filled with dangers she couldn't predict. But it was still a road. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. Not hope for something grand or dramatic, but for something small. Something that didn't need to be fixed or saved. Just a chance. A chance to breathe, to survive. "Do you have a family?" Rita asked after a while, her voice quieter now. She didn't know why she asked. It was a silly question, a distraction. But it came from somewhere deep inside her, from that part of her that was still trying to find some tether to the world. Lucas hesitated before answering. "I did," he said softly. "I had a wife once, and a daughter." Rita felt a pang of sorrow for him, even though she didn't know the full story. She couldn't imagine the weight of losing everything. It was one thing to lose your name, your place in the world. But your family? That was a pain that could never be erased. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small. Lucas shook his head, the motion almost imperceptible. "It's been years. A man learns to live with it." She could hear the resignation in his voice. She understood it. It was the same thing she had been feeling since the moment they had tied that rope around her neck. She had learned to live with the fear, the shame. She had learned to bury it deep, to make herself disappear into the dust. But the fire was still there, flickering inside her. "We all have ghosts," Rita said after a long silence. "We just have to make sure they don't control us." Lucas didn't answer right away, but she could feel his gaze on her, his eyes sharp in the dim firelight. Then finally, he spoke. "You're right," he said quietly. "We just have to survive." The fire crackled again, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The night seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, Rita didn't feel quite so alone. Can Lucas and Rita truly survive the ghosts of their pasts? The next few days bled together in a haze of travel. The ground beneath their boots was dry and cracked, the air heavy with dust. There were no roads, no landmarks to guide them, just the endless horizon and the sound of their horses' hooves breaking the silence. Lucas didn't speak much, and Rita didn't push him. The air between them had shifted in some subtle way, the tension not broken, but acknowledged. They were survivors, both of them, carrying their burdens silently, as the world demanded. As they camped that night, the fire casting long shadows across the land, Rita noticed Lucas staring out into the distance, his face hard with memories. She wanted to ask about his past, about his wife, his daughter, but she was afraid of the answer. Some things, she thought, were better left untouched. "Where are we going?" she asked, the question a quiet one, but the weight of it hung in the air. She had to know. She had to understand if they were just running, or if there was somewhere they could go, some place where she could be free of the ghosts of Red Canyon. Lucas stirred the fire with a long branch, the crackling flames a small comfort against the cold of the night. "I've got a place, far from here, a cabin by the creek. No one will find us." It was a simple answer, but it gave her a strange sense of relief. A cabin. A place that was theirs, separate from the world they had fled. A small dream, maybe. But in a life like hers, dreams didn't need to be big to be important. Rita sat beside him, wrapping her arms around her knees as the wind picked up, carrying the chill of the mountains with it. The night had grown colder, the stars sharp against the black canvas of the sky. "Do you miss it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Your life before?" He didn't respond at first, his eyes still fixed on the fire. It was as if he hadn't heard her, but after a long pause, he spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Sometimes," he said. "I miss the quiet, the simplicity, the way things were before, all of it." There was a deep ache in his words, a pain so raw it felt as if it had carved him out from the inside. Rita didn't ask for details. She didn't need to know the story behind his loss. She could feel it in the way he carried himself, in the way his hands shook when he didn't think anyone was watching. She reached over, her fingers brushing his. It was a small touch, but it felt like a bridge between them. "You're not alone," she said, her voice rough. "Not anymore." He didn't pull away, but his gaze shifted to the sky, his expression unreadable. "I was alone for a long time," he said, "and sometimes that's all I know how to be." It was the truth. Rita saw it, understood it. He was a man who had learned to live with the weight of his past, a man who had buried his emotions so deep that they couldn't surface without pain. She wondered if that was how he had survived, by keeping everything locked away. But she had her own ghosts. She wasn't any better at this than he was. She had learned to bury her pain, to let it eat away at her from the inside until she didn't know what part of her was still alive. "I used to think I could run," Rita said, her voice trembling with something she hadn't expected. "I thought I could outrun all of this, but I can't, can I?" Lucas's eyes turned to her, sharp in the firelight. "No, you can't run from it, not from the past." The words settled between them, unspoken truths that neither of them had wanted to face. "I thought I could forget," Rita whispered, staring into the flames. "But it's like there's a scar on my soul that won't fade." Lucas shifted beside her, the heat of the fire contrasting with the cold inside him. "Scars don't fade. They stay with you. But they don't have to control you." His words were quiet, but they held a depth of understanding that startled her. The man sitting beside her had learned the hard way how to survive. He knew the cost of living with scars. "But what happens when the scars are all that's left?" she asked, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "What happens when everything that made you who you were is gone?" Lucas reached out then, his hand settling on her shoulder. a comforting weight that grounded her in the moment. "You rebuild," he said, his voice low, steady. "You find something new, something worth fighting for." Rita looked up at him, her heart thundering in her chest. The quiet between them shifted once more, and for the first time since they had met, she didn't feel like a prisoner of her past. She felt like she could breathe, like there was still something left worth fighting for. "I don't know if I can rebuild," she said softly, "but I want to try." Lucas nodded slowly, his hand still resting on her shoulder. There was no grand promise in his words, no false hope, just a quiet understanding. "Then we'll try together," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the world, one day at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Rita believed him. Can Rita and Lucas truly rebuild from the ashes of their past? The days blurred into one another as they traveled further into the hills. The air grew thicker with the scent of pine and the rustling sound of the wind through the trees. The rugged terrain was unfamiliar, but Rita felt strangely at home here, away from the prying eyes of the world that had cast her aside. Their journey had been slow, deliberate, and when the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon on the 5th day, Lucas finally spoke of the place he had promised, a cabin, tucked deep in the valley, hidden from prying eyes. It was a place that could offer them a fragile peace, at least for a while. But Rita knew something inside her was still broken. She could feel it just beneath the surface, a sharp, jagged piece lodged in her chest, refusing to let her forget the path that had led her here. There would be no healing without reckoning. By the time that he reached the cabin, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin sat quietly at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by a cluster of ancient trees. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady column, curling up into the sky. It looked like a place that belonged to someone else, someone who had found peace long ago. But there was no peace here. Not for Rita, not for Lucas. The door creaked open as Lucas led her inside. It was a humble place, with rough-hewn wooden beams and a fire crackling in the hearth. There was a small table, a few chairs, and a bed in the corner with a faded quilt. The air smelled of cedar and wood smoke, the scent of a life built from the earth. Rita sat down on the chair by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. The warmth of the flames danced across her skin, but it didn't erase the coldness that had settled deep inside her. She could still feel the rope around her neck, could still hear the silence of the crowd, feel the sting of their eyes. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, his voice quieter now, more tentative than it had been before. Rita didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. How could she? There was no answer to that question. She was alive, yes, but alive didn't mean whole. Alive didn't mean free. "I'm here," Lucas said after a long pause, his words gentle, his gaze fixed on her. "And I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. There was something raw in the way he looked at her, something fragile, like he, too, was barely holding himself together. "I'm not sure what you want from me," Rita said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't meant to say it, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I'm broken, Lucas. I don't know how to put myself back together." He stepped closer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a quiet understanding. "You don't have to be fixed," he said. "You just have to survive." His words hit her like a blow. She had been so focused on what was broken inside her that she hadn't realized she was still breathing, still moving, still surviving. "But how do we survive?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we keep going when everything we were is gone?" Lucas knelt beside her, his face now inches from hers. His eyes softened, his rough hand reaching out to touch her cheek. "You survive by living," he said simply, "by finding something, anything, that keeps you going. A moment, a place, a person. You find something worth fighting for, and you hold on to it, even when everything else is falling apart." Rita swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that survival wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about living with the cracks, about embracing the parts of her that had been lost and still learning to move forward. "Is that all there is?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Just holding on?" "For now," Lucas replied, his voice steady. "For now, that's enough." The cabin was quiet then, save for the crackling of the fire. Rita closed her eyes, letting the heat of the flames warm her skin, but it couldn't touch the coldness in her soul. She wasn't sure what it was she was supposed to do next. She didn't have the answers. She didn't have anything but this broken, battered body, and the memory of a town that had tried to destroy her. But she had survived. And in that, there was something small, something defiant. The crowd had expected her to die, but she was here. She was breathing, and maybe that was enough. She opened her eyes again, finding Lucas's gaze steady upon her, a quiet strength in his silence. There were no promises between them, no grand gestures, but there was something deeper, something unspoken. "We'll make it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination that surprised her. Lucas nodded, his eyes reflecting the same resolve. One day at a time. They sat there in the quiet of the cabin, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't victory, but it was survival. And sometimes survival was enough. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, the fire burned bright. Can survival be enough to heal the scars of the past? Don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. Subscribe now for exclusive content, emotional tales, and unforgettable journeys.